Okay, good evening, everybody, and welcome to our winter gardening program for 2022. For those of you who were with us last year, I did a program pretty much just like this one that covered a lot of aspects of gardening indoors, trying to maintain your plants indoors and what to do for your outdoor plants. Not a lot of the information has changed. I mainly just wanted to make sure that we did this again because I think a lot of you really enjoyed the program and I want to keep it going. So I'm going to dive us right in here. Let's go over some of our common problems and our common solutions. So the common problems are pretty straightforward. Indoors, we run into, just like outdoors, insects and other pests, mites, spider mites, things like that, that can be really stressful, especially when you're trying to tend to a plant and you touch its leaves and all of a sudden a cloud of gnats comes up out of it. Fungi, bacteria, and viruses are also a problem indoors, just like they are outdoors, though I will say in brief that most of those problems are primarily related to how you water your plants. And environmental factors play a big part in how our plants survive indoors. We may think that in our house they have a really stable environment because we don't change the temperature too often, but the trouble is that inside our homes, it's a wildly different experience than outside. This can have a major impact on our plants. Our common sense solutions to these problems are ones that you guys have heard me talk about plenty of times. It usually includes things like integrated pest management plans for handling insects and other pests, carefully observing your plants over time to see what exactly is happening and does it correlate to, say, the soil getting too wet or a change in the time the amount of sun is out. And of course, managing the food and the water that the plants get. A lot of times when we bring our plants inside, it is winter and their needs change greatly when it becomes the colder season. So let's go ahead and dive into my favorite part, the insects. For those of you who aren't aware, I am an entomologist, so I always love talking about the insects first. And first off, we are going to talk about a very common pest indoors, the whiteflies. You can find these in homes and in greenhouses, for those of you who've had that experience. Whiteflies are an extremely common pest when it comes to indoor plants. They will be in just about any indoor environment, especially greenhouses. Greenhouses are forced to spend quite a bit of their money on trying to manage these insects. What happens is they're sap-feeding insects, so they're going to produce stippling and eventually yellowing on the leaves that they feed on. And much like aphids, after feeding, since what they're doing is they're taking in food that's very, very high in sugar, they're going to exude that sugary substance out of their bodies through their waste, which can cause sooty mold to develop on the surface of leaves. The eggs of whiteflies are relatively easy to keep an eye out for. They're just a little bit tiny, so you may want to get a hand lens to look for them, but even I think they kind of stand out. What you're going to look for are these tiny little oval shapes on a short stalk arranged in a circular pattern on like the underside of a leaf. Basically, the female whitefly, when she lays her eggs, is going to create that kind of stalk with a chemical that she produces in her body that kind of fast hardens, and then the egg is stuck to the top of it. And the circular pattern is basically how she's moving her body around as she does her oviposition. The nymph of a whitefly is going to look a lot like the adults. They're going to be tiny little things that are pale green and oval shaped like the adults. They may also have a waxy covering on them that looks like almost kind of like a powdery or very thread-like substance. And as they get larger, you're going to see them develop wings on their bodies too. The adults, like you saw in the picture, are going to be very small insects. They're going to have a very similar powdery or waxy substance, so not as much as when they were young. And of course, they're going to have wings that's going to give them this triangular appearance or roof-like appearance from above. Now, our spider mites, this one is the bane of anybody who has ever been in a greenhouse or worked in a garden, especially when the conditions are right. What you see here is what you get. Spider mites are very tiny. They are mites. They're more closely related to spiders and scorpions than they are insects, so they do represent their own group. Entomologists refer to it as an order called Acari. These are also major pests of greenhouses, and you will see greenhouses just fork over money to try to handle these. And unfortunately, we get them in our homes and our gardens as well. When conditions are right with high temperatures and humidity, spider mites can flourish very easily. However, they're also really easy to tell when they're present because just like you saw in that previous slide, they produce stringy webbing, just like a spider, and it's going to just absolutely coat the leaves and stems of where their activity is the most intense. And for example, if you put your hand on a spot where spider mites are active, you will be able to immediately see all the webbing just come off on your fingers, and it'll be very obvious. I do want to make sure that you're aware, though, that spider mites don't have any ability to harm you. The name spider is entirely due to the webbing. They cannot bite a human being. They are very, very small. You'll normally need a hand lens to be able to see them. However, sometimes you can perceive them with the naked eye. You're going to look for a tiny shape that's going to be vaguely yellow or orange in color, and often with two black spots on either side of their back, their dorsal surface. That is a telltale sign of the Urticus species, so keep an eye out for those. But for the most part, you're going to see the webbing, you're going to know it's a spider mite. Again, those warm temperatures are going to cause populations to absolutely explode. And we typically will see this during the hotter parts of the summer. Now, in our homes, we raise the temperature in our homes quite a bit during the winter, which means we provide a really good environment for them to be able to survive. And sometimes, depending on, like, say they're near a heating vent, they can really just start spreading like crazy in those instances. Now, the damage produced by spider mites is going to be somewhat similar to the whitefly, but a little bit different. So they're going to produce the same kind of stippling on the leaves, those little bumpy, funny spots, or maybe dipped in spots that look an odd color. But in this case, instead of the leaf just yellowing, they're going to take on a bronzed appearance first. And that's the feeding activity by the mites and the remains of the feeding activity, I should say. And then eventually the leaf will turn yellow as the mites just feed on all the sap in the tissue and drain the leaf. A thing to keep an eye out for when it comes to spider mites is that the damage they do is often associated with drought conditions. So if you're inside your home and your plants look like they're suddenly drying out, check for spider mites too, because they could actually be the cause there. So mealybugs is one that we hear of occasionally inside of homes, so I don't hear of this one as often. These insects are related to whiteflies. They're in the same group of insects, the order Hemiptera, excuse me. These are small insects that have this kind of funny powdery wax that covers them that offers protection. So it means that sometimes insecticides may not reach them very easily. They may need some extra care in removing them. They're going to move very slowly across a plant because, again, these are sap feeders. You can kind of treat them as though they behave like cattle. They're going to remain in place for a while they feed on things. Then they're just going to pull their mouth parts out of the plant very slowly and then move on to the next good spot where they feel like eating. Unfortunately, getting rid of them can be a little bit of a challenge. You have to monitor plants constantly for it. In my opinion, the best way to get rid of them is to just get a rag with soapy water on it and just start cleaning off the plants. And that's actually going to work for a lot of these insect pests. Oftentimes, insecticidal soaps do have good effect on them. But again, that powdery wax is going to make a really good defense. Now, a lot of extension publications do say that dabbing individuals in alcohol can kill them quickly, though I would arguably say that you may just be better spending your time by just cleaning them off physically, because these aren't big insects and there could be dozens of them on a plant. So I would just wipe them off and put them in a bucket of soapy water, in my personal opinion. Some of these may be darker in appearance, which could indicate the presence of a parasite that's internal to the insect itself. So that offers a little bit of benefit for controlling them. And sometimes systemic insecticides can be useful in getting rid of them. But again, you're looking at indoor plants. Most likely you aren't really going to be considering a systemic insecticide if you would use one at all. And we all are very familiar with our next guest here, the aphid. Aphids are a very common insect outdoors and unfortunately indoors. They survive in the same conditions that allow whiteflies and mealybugs to survive in. Aphids are soft-bodied individuals. Only certain generations can fly. Most generations are incapable of flight. They are found in greenhouses, homes, gardens. I've seen infestations in trees so thick that you could actually see aphids rain down out of the trees, which is not something I would recommend experiencing. You can also find aphids in crops. For a while there in the Just after the aughts in 2000, say 10 to 12, we were seeing soybean aphids attack crop fields in various parts of the country. They have a unique life cycle where only certain generations actually reproduce sexually and only certain generations are capable of flight. When they're in your home, you may see a few flighted individuals, but for the most part, you're seeing individuals who have no wings. They seem to be able to spread remarkably quickly for some reason. And that reason is this process known as parthenogenesis, where flightless mothers are actually giving live birth to their own daughter clones. They are literally giving birth to an exact copy of themselves. I jokingly often say these things are born pregnant. They're like a tribble. This is why they can reproduce so quickly, especially when temperatures and conditions are just right for them. Feeding can cause plant stunting, much like with whiteflies and mealybugs. You're gonna see a lot of yellowing of leaves. The plant's health will just generally decline as their activity grows. Oftentimes, aphid infestations may not necessarily kill a plant, though. Again, they're kind of like cattle. They'll just sit and feed until they need to move on to a better spot. Aphids are really well known for their tendency to produce sooty mold because their feeding is a very sugary substance, the sap inside of the plant that's just loaded with starches. And their bodies can't process all that sugar. So they have these kind of tailpipes on their bodies we call cornicles, and these tailpipes will exude a substance we call honeydew, which is essentially a sugary waste. That waste is going to go all over the plant surface, and since there's so much sugar, it's a perfect substrate for sooty mold to develop. So if you've seen an aphid infestation, I would highly recommend, once you get the aphids off of there, wipe down the plant. Make sure that there's none of that stuff on there. So that way you can just totally fend off any potential fungal infestations. And again, I mentioned earlier that they can spread very, very rapidly due to that parthenogenesis, the ability to produce their own daughter clones. All right, I've talked plenty about insects, and I'm sure you guys would love to hear more about it, but I will spare you this evening. Let's talk a little bit more about our general indoor management of our plants inside. Now, again, this is going to be just a set of steps, a set of common sense things, in my opinion, that we can do to try to manage our plants, which includes prevention of pests, monitoring the plant's condition, and making sure we maintain good sanitation in our environment. And that means removing dead leaves, getting dead plants out of there. If we have infested plants, we want to make sure the infestation is taken care of, or if it's just too bad, get the infested plant out. You want to get into the habit of regularly checking your plants, looking through them carefully. You don't want to bring in a plant in mid-October and not bother looking at them until you're on Christmas vacation. You're probably going to lose a few plants that way. These regular checks are probably going to involve some cleaning, like horticultural oils, soaps, and other things to make sure that any pests are gone, and you can make sure, again, that things like sooty mold aren't able to develop on the surface of a plant. So let's talk a little bit about our diseases when we're talking about our management here. Now, I've listed a few different major plant diseases that I've found. You can also find a lot of these on a variety of plants you grow in your garden. You probably recognize a few of the names here, like botrytis, bacterial leaf spots, that should be fairly familiar, powdery mildew. All of these things can strike plants indoors, and all of them have a very similar pattern, which is most of the time someone overwatered the plant, or a plant was brought in that was already infested or infected with something. So what I want to encourage you all to do is, before you bring your plants inside, first check them to make sure they have no diseases. I know that you may be looking at a sage plant that you got from your grandmother 40 years ago, but if that sage plant is infested or infected with something, you don't want to risk all your other plants too. You can handle most of the issues with these plants by just doing some smart watering too. And I'm going to talk a little bit about those watering needs. So let's talk a little, went backwards there. Let's talk a little bit about our watering needs in this lovely succulent I have in front of you. I want to preface this by saying the watering needs of a plant when we bring it inside is not going to be the same as the watering needs of a plant growing in the soil outside. We're talking about two totally different animals here. This is because different plants are going to have different requirements as we change their environments. When we get to certain times of year, those requirements are also going to shift. When you're inside your home, you're looking at an environment that is significantly less humid than the outdoor environment. So that means that the plant is experiencing much drier air. It's probably not going to be able to get as much out of its soil, but it also means that it's wintertime. Most plants are entering a dormancy cycle if they haven't already, so their watering needs are going to be low anyways. This means that if you keep putting water into the pots and the plant's not bringing it up, that water is just creating a very wet soil situation, which is perfect for disease development, which is why I definitely want to focus on making sure that you understand watering only needs to be so often. When you do your watering, and this is going to be dependent on plant, I want to make sure you understand that there is no silver bullet for this one. It is plant dependent. When you are watering, apply the water directly to a soil to develop any disease development on the leaf tissue itself. Don't create an entry for fungi to be able to develop on the leaf surfaces. This should be something you're doing whether you're indoors or outdoors, by the way. I always want to scream whenever I see someone sprinkling water from above directly onto a plant, because that is just begging for a fungal disease to start developing. You want to make sure you put your plants in high humidity areas to try to reduce your watering needs too. Now, what I will say here is our homes, like I said, they're really, really dry, especially in the winter. Just talking to you right now, I can feel my lips drying out. This means that we need to provide a source of humidity. One of the things that I recommend is get a small plastic tray that you can put something like river stone in, and then fill the tray up with water. Set your pots to sit on those river stones. That way, all of the water that's in the tray will begin to evaporate over time and increase the humidity in the local area. That is a very easy and inexpensive way of trying to increase your humidity. You also want to make sure you keep good track of where that soil is sitting at any given time. Push your finger into it. See where the moisture stops and where it starts. If the soil is still moist an inch down, you don't need to water. But if it's just dry all the way through, then yeah, you need to consider doing some watering. Oops, that goes backwards. Okay. So like I was saying earlier, I want you guys to keep in mind, when you are indoors, the plants are growing more slowly. It is winter time. The plants are going to be dormant. The watering needs are going to be reduced, so you're going to want to allow the soil to dry out some before you water again. Now, when it comes to your succulent plants, this is going to be very, very important, because if you overwater your succulents, that means that you could cause root rot to develop. And all of a sudden, you're going to go up to your favorite aloe to clip a piece off, and the whole leaf will come with it. Succulents will definitely need to get less water than most other plants. Lillian, I have not personally used a self-watering pot. What I would say is you want to be careful with it, because if it's constantly pushing water through the soil, even at a slow drip, plants in wintertime just simply don't need it. So I would be hesitant to use it until I experimented with it myself. And that may be something that I may do a video on later, because I am kind of curious about it myself. And like I've been harping this entire time, folks, overwatering is going to result in disease development. It's also going to encourage insect development. The little gnats that fly up out of your plants when you touch them are usually fungus gnats, which means that your soil is developing fungus, which means the soil is getting too much water. The minute you reduce the amount you're watering, those fungus gnats will go away. I can't even tell you how many times I've seen this happen before. So just reduce your watering if you're having that particular problem. And I would avoid letting water sit in the bottom of a pan for more than half an hour, because then you're going to see that the soil is simply just it's just locking in a bunch of that water. It's going to stay there, and you can get rot issues developing as time goes on. Gina, there is actually soil that is particularly designed for succulents. I cannot recall the name of it off the top of my head, I'm afraid. If anyone here knows the name of that soil, please feel free to enter it in the chat. But there are particular soils that are recommended for it. And if no one here knows it, just email me, Gina, and I will make sure to get you that name. All right, so let's talk a little bit about our light needs. Light is going to actually be a lot more important than most people realize when you're in an indoor situation. Because if light is coming through a window, it is not the same as light that is outdoors. Our windows block a huge amount of the radiant energy coming out of the sun. We design them that way because there's UV filtering in most modern windows. And most of the time people think, well, I can position my plants in a southern facing window, which is a good idea. You should totally do that. But you're just still not getting as much sunlight as if the plant was outside. There are going to be a lot of factors that are also going to play into this. Let's say you may not be as on top of cleaning your windows as you should be. That's going to actually affect how much light is getting to those plants. The direction facing, of course, southern is going to be best, but also how clear are your windows? Are they filtering very heavily? Are they letting lots of that light in or very little? You know, is the room getting very warm when the sunlight gets in there? Or is it not really changing temperature very much? It's also going to depend on the time of year, because then you're looking at how much actual sunlight is coming through the windows at any given time. If you're talking about around December 20th, you're getting very, very little light coming through those windows, even in the best situations, as the sun just travels, because by the time it gets high, it's probably not getting a whole lot of sunlight coming through. So the plants are getting a really reduced amount of light. And of course, we all love planting trees. I live in Terre Haute, which is a tree city, so there are trees everywhere. And that means that those trees are blocking light coming through my windows. So those are things that are going to affect how well are plants going to be able to do their food creating activities while they're indoors. So there are some important questions I added here that you want to consider when you're positioning your plant inside. And then first are the obvious ones. And this is a question that you should be asking whether or not you bring the plant inside or outside. Or what are the needs? Is the plant shade loving, or do they need full sun? Is it partial or full? That stays just as true in the winter as it does during the summer. You want to ask, how long does an area get sunlight? This, like I said earlier, the duration of sunlight coming in a window is going to change throughout the year. I use the example of December when we get to the point where we're hitting the winter solstice, when we get the least amount of light. And of course, do you have any obstructions, and can you move those obstructions? Some things can be moved, but I'm not moving the 40-year-old oak tree in my yard. So these are things that you need to consider as you're positioning these plants. All right, let's hit up a little bit on fertilizer here. Fertilizer is perhaps the most challenging question that I deal with when folks are asking me about indoor plants, because a lot of people simply don't want to deal with the fact that when it comes to fertilizer, you probably don't need it. I know that you may have disagreements with that, but when you're bringing a plant indoors and it's winter time, and keep in mind that caveat right there, when it's winter time, plants generally shut down. They're not really going to be taking in food. If a plant is not growing, it does not need food. All you're doing then is you're adding nutrients to the soil that could potentially burn the plant. So like I said, the plant is entering a resting stage during the winter. It's not going to do food uptake because it's going dormant. And if it were outside, there'd be no food available for it, and the temperatures would be too cool to grow safely. So the plant is just going to be resting. Any fertilizer is going to be done when the plant is actually growing. And even then, you should only really do it to replace any lost leaves. This is particularly true for plants that are in pots indoors, because you don't want the plant to expand beyond the capacity of the pot as well. So keep that in mind. And when you load soil with nutrients, you want to make sure that the plant can actually take them up. Because if the stuff just stays there, that means that these materials are eventually just going to start burning up the root system, and they're going to start burning up the plant itself once the plant starts doing uptake again. So don't just load your soil up and go. Keep in mind, the plant is at rest. Now, regardless of any kind of fertilizer you choose, I want you guys to always follow the label directions on them. Please trust me on this. Those of us in Indiana, we usually have a mindset of more is better, but that is not necessarily true with fertilizer. You want to make sure you follow those label directions. You also want to consider your micronutrients, your magnesiums, and your manganese, and things like that. So, there are lots of fertilizers that are labeled for them, and this is going to be particular to the plants that you are looking at the moment. You can also use compost to fulfill some of those needs because compost generally has a little bit more micronutrients in it than just a flat fertilizer. Something to also keep in mind too, when you're dealing with an indoor growing situation, is that if you're adding in magnesium, it will often leach out with water because it will bond very, very easily with water and it'll just go with it. All right, so let's talk a little bit about just a few different plants to care for during the winter. I've chosen a few that we've grown in my house. My wife has somehow been able to make plants survive indoors that technically shouldn't have been able to survive indoors. So I'm actually kind of going with some of her opinions on this one too. So let's talk a little bit about caring for basil through the winter, which I know a lot of people say is hard, but folks, I have seen an annual basil survive 3 years indoors. So you can make it happen. Now, a lot of basil species are going to be perennial. However, sweet basil is still an annual, so it will die off. Basil is going to need a lot of sunlight. It is definitely a decent full-size sun plant. You're gonna want to supplement that with artificial light during the winter months to keep it in good condition. Now, one thing I will add to that though, is if you're wanting to keep your basil controlled, you may not necessarily want the artificial light so that way you can keep it a certain size, and that way you can take it back outside and then let it go gangbuster and grow. You definitely want it in a warmer area because this plant does not do well with cold at all. It will kill it. So what I'd suggest is if you put it in a warmer area, the plant may still fail. So you need to be prepared to restart from seed. One thing I would also suggest too is that if you just don't have the time to properly manage basil indoors, you may just want to go ahead and say if it's an annual, let it go to seed, let it develop the seed, because usually then they'll just die off and you can restart from that same seed. Oh, a little tip for you too is if you're trying to keep an annual basil alive indoors, pinch off the flowers. That will prevent it from seeding and you'll cause its biology to skip when it should do its pre-programmed death. All right, talking a little bit about lavender, caring for it through the winter. This is definitely a challenge. I have only seen a few instances where lavender has been able to survive inside, and lots of us have ways of doing it. I just personally have not had success with it myself. So a lot of them, however, can simply survive the winter. If you get hardy varieties like English, lavender types, and just water very lightly when the ground isn't frozen, those species will just flat out survive. They will get through the winter. And especially a winter like this, because we've had limited freezing days. So this has actually been a fairly good year for lavender. More tender varieties though, like your Spanish varieties, you're gonna need to bring them inside and you're gonna treat them similar to basil. Keep them in warm areas and provide them with artificial light to supplement. Unlike basil though, I wouldn't recommend trying to control the size of lavender. When it comes indoors, that lavender is already in for a fight. It is going to need help to survive. Oops, that should have been rephrased. I'm sorry, guys. That should say caring for roses throughout the winter. All right, so roses, I like to talk about roses a lot. Some of you have been to my rose program, so I at least wanted to include a little bit about roses before I closed out our program for the evening. So what I suggest with roses is just plant hardy varieties. Don't worry about covering them until one hard frost has removed the leaves that will trigger the plant's dormancy cycle. Don't worry about it killing the plant if it's a hardy variety. If it is a younger plant or if it is a more tender plant, then yes, I would definitely be more careful of it. You're probably going to want to cover it a little earlier. The thing you want to avoid is a situation where the plant is going through alternating freezing and warming, especially with the soil conditions. Unfortunately, this year has not been one that I would say is a good one for roses because we've had enough days where it'd be frozen one day and warm the next. That's not a good situation for developing roses. You can protect roses by using the practice of mounding or hilling, where you're covering the rose with mulch or leaves or any variety of materials to help protect them from the cold. And of course, you can always get a rose cone from your local garden store. I actually use recyclable ones that have survived for quite a while through rain and snow. So I can definitely tell you they're good. Please don't, I just say, please don't buy styrofoam ones. The styrofoam will be around for 5,000 years. The recyclable ones won't. All right, so that is what I wanted to share with you guys this evening. I've got my contact information here. I've also got links to our Purdue Ed store, which will have publications on a variety of plants, roses, basil, you name it, we've got it. And I've also got a link to our Purdue Plant and Pest Diagnostic Lab. You can use this lab to help diagnose problems that you can't solve any other way. So please feel free to take advantage of these resources.